Good evening. My name's Jane Scarf. I'm coming to you from Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. And I want to talk to you today about the Trudeaus. The father Trudeau, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, and his son Justin. And the question is Justin following in his father's footsteps? And what I mean by that is during the time that Pierre Elliott Trudeau was in office, he had dictatorial power. And the way he got that was through a process of War Measures Act. And that was in 1970, and that was brought in by Parliament to address a crisis that they were having in Quebec called the FLQ crisis. And once that act came into place, that was martial law, and it gave the Prime Minister extraordinary power to deal with this crisis, much more than he would have on the normal basis. And what he did, one of the first things he did, like it was put in for 3 months, and the first thing he did was he changed the actual War Measures Act into an emergency act. And he also changed it so that Parliament didn't have to bring it in. The Prime Minister could bring it in. And then he subsequently declared emergency after emergency to keep us in a state of martial law for 16 years. And during that time, he passed 2,000 bills in closure, and he did it through order in council rather than through the democracy or through the Parliament. And I don't know all of the bills he brought in, but he brought in metric like that. He brought in CSIS like that. He changed the rules, the very strict rules about first-class mail. He softened those up to let law enforcement have better access to it. Also, wiretapping, same thing. He made it a more loose process to wiretap, and God knows what other things. But 2,000 in total, and the way it would appear, just like a king putting up a notice of a new law on the tree, he would just bang. There's a new law. There you go. And I would say very clearly that means during the time he was in, he acted in the capacity of a dictator. And he did harm to our democracy. He removed lots of the checks and balances we had. And he said he was creating a strong central government, which means he was, looking at removing the things that help balance the power out, and also he was desirous of removing our rights, or at least giving the government better opportunity to override our rights. So he, by bringing in the charter, he was giving his cohorts, the New World Order bunch, a way in. And that way in was Section 1. That allows the government to override your rights if they think they have a good enough reason. And then if you disagree with that, and you feel that it was unreasonable, the limits, you have to initiate a constitutional challenge. And then down the road sometime, you'll get a judge to decide whether you're going to have your rights back or not. And obviously in this pandemic, you can see how preposterous that is when they're even closing the courts on top of it. So, and what kind of right is that? That you have to, have wheelbarrows full of money to initiate, and then all the time and all the harm that's done in the meantime while your rights are violated. So definitely that was not done in the interests of Canadians. But we still have our Bill of Rights, however, and that was brought in 1960, and it does not give the government any authority to override your rights. The only opportunity that can be to change any of the rights is through a full act of Parliament. and initiated, discussed, voted 3 times, public consultation, all that. So that's not anywhere near as much of a threat as having the standing government be able to just say, "Oh, there's your bylaw. You know, we're gonna shut your gatherings down," which includes your house if you have too many guests at Christmas, your business, your church, all that. Like at your protest, same thing in Toronto. There was tremendous interference of protest in Toronto and churches. Basically, all of our fundamental rights are violated with bylaws, nonetheless, provincial bylaws. So this is not good. But to the question of whether Trudeau Jr., Justin, followed in his father's footsteps, I would say there's been an attempt made for him to follow in his footsteps. However, he isn't cutting the mustard, because after Trudeau left office in 1984, immediately after, there was a bill introduced that would slam that door from any prime minister in the future being able to call an emergency and then start smashing rights. And what that act is called is the Emergency Act, federal. And if you look in the preamble, in the 3rd paragraph of the preamble, it says that in the emergency planning, they have to regard the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Canadian Bill of Rights, and the international covenants of social and political rights. And they're not allowed to abridge these rights, even in the case of a national emergency, regardless of what it is. So, obviously, Trudeau Jr. has not been able to, come into the same level of dictatorialship as Daddy did. So he's just banging off these bylaws that aren't even legal. They're violation of the Canadian Bill of Rights, which you don't have to initiate a constitutional challenge or any kind of challenge for. Your rights are immediate. You can assert your rights in the immediate. And and if you're defending yourself from any kinds of prosecution for asserting your rights, again, you can defend yourself without giving notice, whatever. You can just use the Bill of Rights and say they didn't have the right to give me this ticket or close my business or do whatever they did, because it's a violation of my rights. Because you have a right to life, liberty, security of person, and unlike the Charter, you have a right to enjoyment of property and not to be deprived thereof, except by due process of law. That's number 1A of the Canadian Bill of Rights. And Section 2 of the Bill of Rights says government cannot override, no matter what. No way, no how. And that bill is still active. And the Charter itself, actually, Section 26, states that any rights that pre-existed the Charter are still in effect. So we have 2 basic rights there prior to the Charter. One is the property rights that I just mentioned, and the other is for a right for the government to recognize and protect our rights at all times with no limitations. That's in the Bill of Rights. So that still applies till today. So if you look at the kinds of things that Justin's doing, they kind of flex the dictatorial muscle, but at the end of the day, they're jokes. The quarantine, it's a joke. Like, oh yeah, we're gonna force you and blah blah blah, and you gotta pay for it, blah blah blah, and maybe we're gonna get police to do something, but the police didn't do anything. You got a ticket that you can fight easily because they have no business forcing you into quarantine centers or hotels that they designate as quarantine. Like, that's complete garbage. As well, the federal mask bylaw, also garbage, because Section 1A of the Canadian Bill of Rights gives you the right to voluntary informed consent. So mandatory is involuntary, obviously, so that violates that part. Plus, they're not advising people of the risks that they're taking when they're wearing those masks, and the risks primarily is the risk of getting sick by either bacteria being breathed in, a virus, and also the carbon dioxide. So are we being told about those risks? No, we're not. So that right is violated. And PCR also, they're not allowed to do anything that penetrates in the body. So that penetrates in the body. That's even in the Quarantine Act, saying that they can't require that. So basically a bunch of BS bylaws is what you have. So that doesn't add up to a dictator. And if you've noticed in Ontario, at least, the regional police have refused to do the stay-at-home orders to enforce them. 44 out of 44 regional police have refused. The RCMP in Ontario say that it's not even in their mandate to do any of this enforcement of these bylaws. OPP, on the other hand, have said they are willing to basically violate your rights, no problemo. So they're going to be taken to task on that. Now, other provinces, have different conditions. I can't speak to them all, but I can say that by and large, the majority of police in Ontario are backing the people. Also, I don't see any military in anybody's face either. The only military that we've seen in Ontario is some medic tents in Hamilton. Military can come under the Emergency Act to help. That's it. They can't come to demand your ID and where you're going and, helping close your business, all that crap. Nope, not allowed to do it. Because military are also falling under the Canadian Bill of Rights because they're federal. So all the police and all the military are under the Canadian Bill of Rights. And they can't, there's no provision in Canadian federal law to bring in martial law. So people that are going around worried that this is going to happen, it can't happen legally. And it doesn't appear to be, we don't seem to be advancing into martial law. And as a matter of fact, it seems to be regressing because they've backed down on the quarantine. And they've, people are just saying, no, I'm not taking that PCR test. And Dan Dick's like, no, I'm not giving you my ID when I'm driving home across the so-called border. And no, I'm not telling you where I'm going. Just enough to say I'm going home, that's it. So the supervisor of the police came to his car and said, well, you said you're going home. Well, that's good enough. So basically he showed you that there's no borders, and we don't have to show ID, and we don't have to tell them where we're going. And if they give you a ticket for not doing that, that ticket is beatable because those are police. They're not supposed to be violating your rights. And certainly a provincial bylaw doesn't give police who are federally regulated authority to overstep their power. So we are not in martial law, and legally we cannot be in martial law. Now, I can't say 100% that won't happen. Like if things advance to the point where they're acting illegally, like if they want to step into that and act illegally, I can't predict that I can't say for sure that that's not going to happen, but I can say for sure martial law is not legal in Canada. And therefore, the short of this long dialogue that I've just presented is that Trudeau Sr. was a dictator, and his son that follows is merely a dictator wannabe. Good night. I have some questions here. Okay. I was going to turn off if I can figure it out.